My Uncle Dennis stood up in that courtroom, pointed at his own 81-year-old mother, and shouted, "She's DF. She has no idea what's happening. She hasn't understood a full sentence in years." The judge looked at my grandmother. My grandmother looked at her attorney. And her attorney, a quiet man named Alan Pierce, reached into his briefcase and placed a small gray box on the table in front of him. He opened it slowly, the way you open something you've been waiting months to open. Inside were two hearing aids. Slate gray, custom molded, calibrated by me, personally, on the first Saturday of every month for the past 2 years. Mr. Pierce looked up at the judge and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to enter these into evidence," along with 24 monthly calibration records signed by a licensed audiologist, and one sealed envelope my client has been keeping for 8 months. I watched my uncle's face change. I watched Aunt Paula grab his sleeve. I watched my Aunt Brenda close her eyes like someone who had just heard a door lock behind her. Because here's what my family never understood. They spent years talking about my grandmother right in front of her, planning around her, dividing up her house while she sat 3 feet away, sipping her tea. They thought her silence meant absence. But I'm an audiologist. Silence is my profession. And I can tell you the exact difference in decibels between someone who can't hear you and someone who is simply letting you finish. My grandmother heard every word, every single word. And what was inside that sealed envelope didn't just end my uncle's plan. It ended it using his own voice. Before I take you back to the beginning, I want to know something. Where are you watching from right now? What city? What time is it there? Drop it in the comments. I read every one, and honestly, it amazes me how far these stories travel. And if you've ever sat in a room while your own family talked about you like you weren't there, you're going to want to stay for this one. Hit subscribe, because this story doesn't end the way they planned. It ends the way she planned. My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 38 years old, and I run a small audiology clinic in a converted brick storefront that used to be a watch repair shop. I like to think the building never really changed professions. The old man who worked there before me spent 50 years leaning over tiny mechanisms that people brought in saying the same thing. It stopped working, and I don't know when. That's my job too. Hearing loss almost never announces itself. It doesn't happen all at once. It slips away one frequency at a time, so gradually that most people don't come to me when they start losing sound. They come to me when they start losing people. When the grandkids stop calling because grandma never understands anyway. When the dinner invitations dry up. When the family starts finishing their sentences for them, then starts skipping their sentences entirely. I tell every new patient the same thing on their first visit. Hearing loss doesn't happen all at once. Neither does losing a family, and most people can't tell you the exact day either one started. I can. For me, both stories start with the same woman. My grandmother's name is Lorraine Foster. And to understand what she did to my Uncle Dennis, what she did with nothing but 2 hearing aids, a notary, and the patience of a woman who raised 3 children and buried a husband, you need to understand what she did for me first. I was 12 years old when my mother died. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by October. My father had left when I was 4. He sent a card that November with a $20 bill in it, and the words, "Hang in there," and that was the last physical evidence I ever had that the man existed. So at 12, I was, in the eyes of the state and the family, a problem to be solved. I remember sitting at the top of the stairs at my mother's wake, listening to the adults below decide my future in the way adults do when they think grief makes children deaf. Uncle Dennis, my mother's older brother, said, and I remember the exact words, because some sentences calcify in you. "We've got 2 kids already. Paula's got her hands full, and honestly, Nora's always been a strange little thing." Aunt Brenda said, "We just don't have the room with the renovation." There was a silence after that, the particular silence of a family waiting for someone else to volunteer. And then I heard my grandmother's voice. Lorraine was 63 years old then, 5'2" in her church shoes, and she said one sentence that redirected my entire life. "The child is not a burden to be passed around. She's coming home with me. This discussion is over." That was it. No debate. Nobody argued with Lorraine Foster in 1999 because there was nothing to argue with. She didn't raise her voice. She just made a decision and then made it true. So I grew up in my grandmother's house. A white two-story colonial on Maple Crest Lane with green shutters she repainted herself every 4 years, a kitchen that permanently smelled of cinnamon and dish soap, and a porch swing where she taught me how to shell peas, how to balance a checkbook, and how to tell when a person is lying to you. Her rule for that last one, by the way: don't watch their mouth, sweetheart. Watch their hands. The mouth rehearses. The hands forget too. She never once made me feel like charity. When I won the 8th grade science fair, she was in the front row with a disposable camera. When I got my driver's license, she rode shotgun on my first solo drive with her hand calmly on the dashboard, saying, "I've survived worse drivers. I married one." When I got into college, the first in the family, she took the acceptance letter, read it twice, and then put it in a frame she'd apparently bought weeks earlier. She'd been that sure. Her whole life ran on quiet certainty like that. Grandpa Earl had died back in 1994, and Lorraine had taken over everything. The house, the finances, the small rental property Earl left behind, and run it all with a green ledger book and a level head. By the time I was in high school, the house on Maple Crest was paid off completely. Free and clear. Remember that. The house matters. Everything in this story eventually comes back to that house, the way everything in a hearing test eventually comes back to one question. What are you actually able to perceive, and what have you just been nodding along to? Now, my Uncle Dennis. Dennis Foster is my grandmother's firstborn, 11 years older than my late mother, and the kind of man who has spent his entire life being about to succeed. Every family has one. The business that was always 6 months from taking off. The investment that was a sure thing until it wasn't. The pickup truck bought new, financed at a rate he wouldn't say out loud. Dennis sold above-ground pools, then supplements, then a franchise coffee cart that lasted 9 months, and by his late 50s he'd landed in what he called consulting, which as far as anyone could tell meant borrowing. His wife, my Aunt Paula, was the engine behind the wheel. Paula never met a room she didn't measure. I mean that literally. The first time she walked into my grandmother's house after Earl's funeral, I watched her stand in the dining room, look up at the crown molding, and say, "You know what this place would go for now?" She said it like a compliment. Paula said a lot of things like compliments. And then there was Aunt Brenda, my grandmother's youngest. Brenda wasn't cruel. I want to be fair about this, because it matters later. Brenda was something that in a family can be more dangerous than cruel. Brenda was agreeable. Whoever spoke last, whoever spoke loudest, that was Brenda's position. She'd nod along with Dennis at Thanksgiving, and then call Grandma the next morning to say she didn't really mean it. She spent her whole life at a comfortable distance from her own opinions. For years, none of this mattered much. The family orbit was stable. Holidays at Grandma's. Dennis arriving late with a new scheme. Paula appraising the furniture with her eyes. Brenda agreeing with everyone. And Lorraine at the head of the table, seeing all of it and saying little. Then, the spring my grandmother turned 79. 2 things happened almost at the same time. And looking back, with the professional hindsight I now have, the kind where I can chart the exact moment a family's word recognition score started to drop, those 2 things were the beginning of everything. The first thing, my grandmother's hearing, which had been fading gently for a decade, crossed the line from inconvenient to isolating. She started asking people to repeat themselves, then stopped asking, because she'd learned what every one of my patients learns, that the third what is the one that makes people sigh. She started nodding along at family dinners, smiling in the right places, going quiet. And the second thing, Uncle Dennis, 56 years old and drowning in a debt he was still calling a cash flow situation, came to Sunday dinner, looked around that paid-off house with his wife's eyes, and asked a question. He asked it casually, over pot roast, in the tone a man uses when he's rehearsed something in the car. "Mom," he said, "have you thought at all about what happens to the house?" My grandmother looked up from her plate, and she did something I didn't understand until much, much later. She said, "What was that, dear? You'll have to speak up." At the time, I thought it was just her ears. I was the only one at that table with a license to know better, and even I missed it. That's the thing about my grandmother that took me 38 years to fully learn. Lorraine Foster never wasted a single weakness. Other people hid their weaknesses. She filed hers away like tools in case one turned out to have a use. Dennis repeated the question, louder, slower, with that exaggerated patience people put on for the elderly, the tone that is technically a courtesy and functionally an insult. "The house, Mom. Have you made any plans?" "For the house." "Oh," Grandma said, and smiled and patted his hand. "The house is fine, dear. I had the gutters done in April." And she went back to her pot roast. I watched Dennis look at Paula. I watched Paula give him a look back that I couldn't read then, but that I would learn to read fluently over the next 2 years. It was a look that said, "See? It's already easier than we thought." That was the spring everything started. But before I take you into what Dennis and Paula did, and believe me, we're getting there, every dollar and every document of it, I need to tell you about the hearing aids, because the hearing aids are the whole story. The hearing aids are why my uncle is, as of this recording, living in a rented duplex and paying his own attorney in installments. A few weeks after that dinner, Grandma called my clinic. Not me, my clinic. She called the front desk and booked an appointment under her full name, Lorraine Foster, like a stranger. When I came out to the waiting room and saw her sitting there with her purse on her knees, filling out the new patient form in her upright Sunday school handwriting, I said, "Grandma, you know you can just call me." She said, "You don't fix family for free, sweetheart. That's how resentment starts. Bill me like anyone else." Then she looked at me over her glasses and added, "And I expect the good ones. I've heard the cheap ones whistle." So I tested her properly, the way I'd test anyone. And I'm going to tell you what I found, because the numbers matter later. They end up in a courtroom, on a projector, with a judge leaning forward to read them. My grandmother had moderate to severe sensorineural hearing loss in both ears, the ordinary erosion of age. Muted, in a noisy room, say, a family dinner with 9 people talking over each other, she was probably catching 30, maybe 40% of speech and filling in the rest from context and lip reading, which she had gotten quietly, formidably good at. That's what the nodding was. That's what the smiling was. My patients do it every day. It's called bluffing, and families mistake it for fading. But here's the finding that mattered, the one I typed into her chart without any idea I was loading a weapon. Her word recognition score. The measure of what the ear and brain can do with sound once it's made loud enough was 96%. 96. At 79 years old. I've had patients half her age score worse. I remember explaining it to her in my little consult room with the felt-lined walls. "Grandma, your ears are quieter, but there's nothing wrong with your understanding. With the right aids calibrated right, you'll hear better in a crowded room than half the people in it. You don't have a comprehension problem. You have a volume problem." My grandmother was quiet for a moment. She looked at the audiogram the way she used to look at my report cards, like she was deciding what the numbers were worth. Then she said something I've repeated to myself 100 times since. "So what you're telling me," she said, "is that the problem was never whether I could understand. The problem was whether anybody bothered to reach me." "That's actually a very good way to put it," I said. She said. "It usually is once people speak up." I fitted her with 2 custom aids, slate gray, nearly invisible under her white hair, the good ones, exactly as ordered. And on the first Saturday of the following month, she came in for her first fine-tuning. And a ritual was born that would run, uninterrupted, for the next 2 years. First Saturday, 9 a.m., before the clinic opened. I'd unlock the door, She'd be standing there with 2 coffees and a paper bag of cinnamon rolls from Hollis Bakery, and we'd sit in the booth together while I ran her aids through the software, adjusting gains, checking thresholds, logging everything. Some families go to church together. We went to frequencies. And every single session, I did what I'm required by license and habit to do. I documented it. Date, settings, speech and noise results, her word recognition holding steady at 95-96%, signed, saved, backed up. 24 months of records saying, in clinical language no lawyer could shake, this woman hears and this woman understands. I want to be honest with you about something, because this channel is nothing if I'm not honest. I didn't document all that because I suspected anything. I documented it because that's the job. I spend my days measuring what people miss. I had no idea that I was also, month by month, measuring exactly how much my family was about to miss about her. Because here's what happened out in the world while those records quietly stacked up in my filing system. My grandmother made a decision I didn't understand at the time. She wore her hearing aids everywhere. The pharmacy, the bank, her bridge club, Sunday service, everywhere except family gatherings. The first time I noticed, it was Easter at her house, maybe 4 months after the fitting. I leaned in while she was basting the ham and said quietly, "Grandma, where are your aids?" "Oh," she said, not looking up. "I don't bother with them when it's just family. Too much clatter, all those voices." That's literally what they're calibrated for. I set the noise program myself. She turned around then, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave me a look I'd known my whole life. The porch swing look. The watch their hands look. "Nora Jean," she said, which is what she calls me when a conversation is about to be over. "There are 2 kinds of listening. There's the kind where people know you can hear them, and there's the kind where they've decided you can't." She picked the ham back up. "You learn different things from each." I laughed. God help me, I laughed, because I thought it was one of her porch aphorisms. I did not understand that my 79-year-old grandmother had just described in 2 sentences an intelligence gathering operation. Because at family dinners, something had shifted. The family had watched her ask people to repeat themselves for 2 years before the fitting. And since she didn't bother with the aides around them, they simply carried their assumption forward, and then they carried it further. It's a gradual thing, the way a family goes deaf to a person. First they talk louder at you. Then they talk slower at you. Then they talk around you. And this is the stage Dennis and Paula reached by that summer. They talk about you, in front of you, in a normal voice, at your own table, while you pour the coffee. I heard it happen, and I'm ashamed how long it took me to really hear it. Paula, at Grandma's own birthday dinner, saying to Brenda across the table, "Across Grandma, the upkeep on this place is getting to be too much for her. You can see it." Grandma, 3 feet away, arranging cake forks. Dennis, in the den, on the phone, not even lowering his voice. It's a conversation we have to have soon. The house is just sitting there as equity. Grandma in her armchair by the door, doing the crossword. Brenda, sighing to me in the kitchen. It's sad. She's really starting to slip. She doesn't follow anything anymore. While Grandma, at the counter, filled in 17 across. They had decided she was gone. And once a family decides you're gone, they stop performing for you. The masks come off. People will say things in front of someone they believe can't hear them that they would never say in an empty room, because an empty room at least feels like it might be listening. Kanasgara as it come. It must been. My grandmother sat in the middle of all of it with 96% word recognition, and the best hearing aids I have ever personally programmed, tucked in her purse in their little gray box. No, that's not quite right. And the exact truth matters, because the exact truth is what ends up notarized. Most of those dinners, the aids really were in her purse, and she was reading lips and faces at close range, at which, I later learned, she barely needed the aids at all for people she'd known 40 years. But some dinners, the ones that mattered, the ones she had reason to expect were going to matter. The aids were in, turned on, programmed to the exact setting I built for crowded rooms, invisible under that white hair. And she kept a record. Of course she kept a record. This is the woman who ran a household out of a green ledger for 30 years. Every date, every sentence worth keeping. Who said it? Who was in the room? Who said nothing? Because she counted the silences too. Brenda's silences are all in there. I knew none of this. Nobody did. For over a year, the only two entities on Earth that knew what Lorraine Foster could hear were me, via clinical records I'd almost forgotten about, and a spiral notebook she kept inside a zipped pocket of her knitting bag, underneath a half-finished sweater she never intended to finish. She told me later she'd chosen the knitting bag deliberately. Nobody in this family, she said, has ever once been curious about my knitting. By the following fall, Dennis's cash flow situation had become a cash flow catastrophe. I found out the details later, in Discovery, but the family could all feel the shape of it that autumn. The truck disappeared, replaced by a sedan with a dealer plate that stayed on too long. Paula's tone about the house stopped being wistful and started being operational. Fewer you knows, more we shoulds. And in the second week of November, Grandma called me on a Tuesday evening and said, in a voice I'd never heard her use, light, almost amused, and underneath it, something with edges, Nora Jean. You're coming to Thanksgiving, yes? Of course. Good, she said. Come early, and bring my spare set. Your spare aids? Why? Is something wrong with... Nothing's wrong, said my grandmother, but Dennis has been rehearsing something. I can hear it in his hands. A pause. This year, I'd like to be wearing the good ears. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment after she hung up, staring at my kitchen wall. I can hear it in his hands. 40 years of watching people's hands while they thought she was watching their mouths. And now, apparently, she could hear rehearsal in the way her own son carried himself. I didn't know yet what she knew. I just knew that my grandmother had asked for backup, and in her language, the spare set of hearing aids was exactly that, backup. Thanksgiving that year was at the house on Maple Crest, the way it had been every year of my life. I came at noon, 3 hours early, with the spare aids in my coat pocket in their charging case. Grandma was in the kitchen with the parade on the little counter TV, muted, and 2 pies already cooling. She kissed my cheek, took the case from my hand like it was a dish I'd brought, and set it on the counter next to the gravy boat. Sit, she said. Peel. So I peeled potatoes while my 80-year-old grandmother laid out, with the calm of a woman narrating a recipe, what she believed was about to happen at her own dinner table. Dennis called me twice this week, she said. He never calls twice. And both calls, he talked about how big this house is, how hard the winters are, how Marjorie Pruett down the street sold hers and moved to one of those communities and has never been happier. She snorted softly. Marjorie Pruett cried at her own farewell luncheon and gripped my wrist like a drowning woman. Never been happier. Grandma? And Paula, she went on, quartering an onion with a sound like punctuation, sent Brenda a link to a place called Willow Gardens. Brenda forwarded it to me by accident. She meant to send me a casserole recipe. She wiped her eye. The onion, only the onion. Willow Gardens, Nora Jean. It's 40 minutes away. You don't put someone 40 minutes away because you plan on visiting. I stopped peeling. What do you want me to do? And my grandmother turned around, and this is the moment I understood that whatever happened next had been planned the way she planned everything. Thoroughly, quietly, and long before anyone else knew a decision was being made. Nothing, she said. That's the whole job, sweetheart. You do nothing. You sit at that table, you eat your dinner, you keep your face pleasant, and no matter what you hear. Nothing. Not one word. You don't defend me. You don't correct anyone. You don't look at me sideways. She reached over and put the spare aids in, one, then the other, tucking them under the white hair with 2 practiced fingertips. And just like that, they vanished. They believe the room is empty, she said. Let's keep it that way one more time. Grandma, why? If you know what they're planning, why sit through it? She looked at me for a moment, and there was nothing frail anywhere in that kitchen. Because right now all I have is what I suspect, she said. And suspicion is worthless. You of all people should understand this, Nora Jean. You don't tell a patient they're losing their hearing because you suspect it. You put them in the booth. You take the measurement. She turned back to the stove. Today I'm taking the measurement. At 3 o'clock the family arrived in the order. They always arrived. Brenda first, with a casserole and a hug for everyone, agreeable from the doorway. Then Tyler, my cousin, 27, Dennis and Paula's boy. Quiet that year, I remember, hovering near the bookshelves, looking at family photos like a visitor. And at 3:40, Dennis and Paula, 20 minutes late, Paula in the lead carrying a bottle of wine like an admission ticket, Dennis behind her in a blazer that didn't fit the way it used to, wearing the specific joviality of a man about to ask for something. You should know that on the surface, for the first hour, it was a completely ordinary Thanksgiving. That's the part that still gets me, even now. The turkey came out. Grandma said grace. The same 22 words she said my whole life. Plates went around. Tyler was teased about a girlfriend nobody had met. Brenda told a story about her neighbor's dog. Utterly, immaculately ordinary. And underneath the table, when Paula asked Grandma if she wanted her hearing checked again because you're awfully quiet tonight, Mom. And Grandma smiled and said, "What was that, dear?" Underneath the table, my grandmother's hand found my knee and rested there, light as a leaf. Steady, nothing. The turn came with the coffee, the way it always does. There's a moment at every family table when the meal is over and the room reshuffles and whoever has an agenda has been waiting for it. Grandma stood, gathered the dessert plates, and announced she'd put the coffee on. And then she did the thing that I will be describing to you for the rest of this story. The small, ordinary thing that ended up in a court record. She took out her hearing aids. Or she performed taking out her hearing aids. Standing at the head of the table, in full view of everyone, she reached up to her ears, made the exact gesture, brought her hands down, and set something in her little dish by the napkin holder, where, I realized with my heart slamming, the first set had been sitting all along, placed there that morning, like a prop on a stage. "These things whistle at me when the coffee grinder runs," she said to no one in particular, patted the dish, and walked into the kitchen. The good ears, the spares, my spares, programmed by me for exactly this acoustic environment, this dining room, this level of ambient clatter, stayed exactly where they were. Invisible? On. Listening. I sat very still and understood that I was watching an 80-year-old woman run an operation on her own family, and that every person at that table except me had just been told, in the language they'd chosen to believe for 2 years. The room is now empty. The kitchen door swung shut. The coffee grinder started, and Dennis put down his napkin and said to the table, in a completely normal voice, "Okay, while she's in there, we need to talk about Mom." What happened in the next 11 minutes? And it was 11, I know, because there was a verified timestamp on it before Christmas. I'm going to give you almost word for word. I can do that. There's a document. Every sentence I'm about to tell you exists on paper, dated, notarized, and it was read aloud in a courtroom 14 months later, while my uncle sat there turning the color of the tablecloth. Paula opened her folder. She had brought a folder to Thanksgiving. She laid it next to the pumpkin pie and said, "We've done the numbers. Willow Gardens has an opening in their assisted wing after the first of the year. It's $2,900 a month, which sounds like a lot until you look at this." She turned the page around so Brenda could see it, which is what the house appraises at as of October. $740,000. Conservatively, the market's only holding through spring, Dennis said. "Everybody says so." Brenda's voice, small. "Has anyone actually asked Mom if she wants—" Brenda. Dennis, patient, the way he'd been patient with his mother's ears. "You've seen her tonight. She asked Paula to repeat herself 3 times. She's not following. Asking her isn't a kindness, it's a formality. And formalities are how estates get eaten by lawyers. And then my Uncle Dennis leaned back in his mother's chair, at his mother's table, 12 feet from his mother, and said the sentence. The one from the thumbnail. The one that ends up mattering more than any other sentence he has ever spoken in his 60 years of speaking. Relax. She can't even hear us. She won't remember any of this. We settle it now, between us, and after the holidays we present it to her, nice and simple. 1 page. Big print. Someone laughed. I wanted on record that someone laughed, and that it was Paula. I was staring at my coffee going cold, doing the only job I'd been given. Nothing. And it was the hardest professional discipline of my life. Because I knew the exact gain settings in that room. I knew the speech and noise program was handling the dishwasher hum and pulling voices forward, clean, at conversational distance. 96% word recognition. They were speaking directly into the best calibrated ears in the county. Paula slid the folder toward Dennis. Then we're agreed on the listing agent. And the proceeds. 3 ways after her care costs, Dennis said. Even. Fair's fair. Even, Brenda repeated. Just that. Just the one word, which is how Brenda has agreed to everything her entire life. And that word is in the document too, Aunt Brenda. Page 2. The kitchen door swung open. Grandma came through it with the coffee tray, and the table transformed. Folders vanished, faces reassembled. Dennis boomed, "There she is," in his talking to mom voice. Grandma set down the tray, poured, asked Tyler twice whether he took sugar, got it wrong anyway, laughed at herself. A sweet, slightly foggy old woman, if that's what you'd already decided you were looking at. She took her seat at the head of the table, and under it her hand found my knee again. And this time it wasn't light. She gripped once, hard, a full second, and let go. To this day it is the single loudest thing I have ever felt. I have to stop right here for a second. A quick pause, from me to you. If you have ever sat in a room while people talked about you like you weren't in it, like the chair you were sitting in was empty, I want you to tell me in the comments. Comment asterisk, the room was never empty. If you've lived this, because I read these comments every night, and I promise you there are more of us than you think. And if you're new here, subscribe now. Because what my grandmother did in the next 8 months, quietly, legally, and with her own son's words as the blueprint, is the reason this channel exists. Because that night, after the cars pulled out of the driveway, my grandmother locked the front door, sat down at the kitchen table she'd just cleared, and took out the spiral notebook from the knitting bag. She wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. Then she capped the pen, looked up at me over her glasses, and said, "Monday morning, you're driving me to see a man named Alan Pierce." I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my old room upstairs, the one with the science fair ribbon still pinned to the corkboard, because my grandmother doesn't take things down, she archives them in place, and I lay there listening to the house I grew up in and doing math I didn't want to do. 740,000 3 ways after her care costs. My family had appraised, allocated, and dissolved this woman's entire life between the pie and the coffee, in 11 minutes at her own table, and she had asked me to do nothing. So I had done nothing. I want to be honest about how that felt, because I think some of you know this feeling. It felt like swallowing glass and calling it dinner. I came downstairs at 6:30. She was already up. Of course she was already up, sitting at the kitchen table in her robe with a cup of tea, the spiral notebook closed under her folded hands, watching the backyard go from gray to gold. Her hearing aids were in. Both sets, actually, were on the table, the decoy pair in their little dish, and the charging case beside them, lid open, like evidence already being organized. I sat down across from her. For a while neither of us said anything. Then my grandmother said quietly, in a voice with no performance left in it at all. I heard every word. "I know, Grandma. No." She shook her head slowly. "Your mind." I need to say it out loud once in this kitchen, before it becomes paperwork. So listen to me. She turned her teacup a quarter turn, the way she does when she's setting her thoughts down in order. I heard my firstborn son price my house while I poured his coffee. I heard my daughter-in-law read my death out of a folder like a weather report. I heard my daughter, my Brenda, say even. Her voice caught one notch on Brenda, not on Dennis. I noted that, and I've never forgotten it. I raised those two on this street. I nursed Dennis through scarlet fever in that front room, and last night I learned that to my own children, I am not a mother anymore. I am a delay. Grandma, let me finish, Nora Jean. She looked up, and her eyes were dry and absolutely level. Here is what we are not going to do. We are not going to shout. We are not going to call anyone this morning and have it out. We are not going to give Paula a scene she can retell for 20 years with herself in the starring role. A scene is what they're equipped for. A scene they'd survive. She tapped the notebook once with one finger. We are going to do this my way. Quietly, on paper. Because paper doesn't get tired. Paper doesn't get talked over. And paper, and here, I swear to you, my 80-year-old grandmother almost smiled. Paper doesn't need hearing aids. And what's my job? I asked. Your job, she said, is the same job you've had since you were 12. You're the only one in this family who ever wrote things down properly. She stood, rinsed her cup, set it in the rack. Monday, 9 o'clock. Alan Pierce. And on the way you can explain to me, in words a jury could follow, exactly what those little machines of yours can and cannot do. Because I suspect, sweetheart, that your filing cabinet and my knitting bag are about to become very close friends. Alan Pierce's office was on the second floor of a bank building downtown, above the actual bank, which Grandma said she found reassuring, like the money has a lawyer sitting on its head. He'd been Earl's attorney back in the 80s for the rental property, and Grandma had kept him for her will the way she kept her dentist and her roofer, vetted once, retained for life. He was past 60, gray at the temples, with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the general air of a man who had seen every kind of family and stopped being surprised in 1997. I want to walk you through this meeting carefully, because everything that happens in the courtroom 14 months later, every exhibit, every objection Dennis's lawyer loses, gets built in this 1 hour, in that plain little office with the radiator ticking. Grandma sat down, refused coffee, and said, Alan, 3 questions. Then a great deal of work. Good morning to you too, Lorraine. First question. If my children believe I am incompetent, what can they legally do to me? Pierce took the glasses off his forehead and put them on properly, which I learned over the following months was his tell for, now it's real. He explained it plainly. They couldn't just sell her house. Her name was on the deed, full stop. But there was a process, guardianship or conservatorship. A petition to a probate court claiming she could no longer manage her own affairs. If a judge agreed, the court could appoint someone, typically the petitioning family member, to control her finances, her property, her medical decisions. It's designed to protect people, Pierce said. In the right hands, it does. In the wrong hands, it's a crowbar with a notary stamp. And the evidence for such a petition? Medical opinions, testimony from family about confusion, decline, isolation. Missed bills, that sort of thing. He paused. Lorraine, why am I being asked this on the Monday after Thanksgiving? So she told him. All of it, start to finish, in that level ledger-keeping voice, the 2 years of she can't follow anything. Willow Gardens, the folder next to the pumpkin pie, the appraisal, the 11 minutes. Pierce didn't interrupt once. When she finished, he looked at her for a long moment and said, You're certain of what you heard? Because their entire theory will be that you can't be. And my grandmother said, That's the second question, Alan. It's for my granddaughter. She turned to me. Tell him. I gave him the clinical picture the way I'd give it to a referring physician. Bilateral, moderate to severe sensorineural loss, A volume problem. Treated with properly fitted devices, functionally normal conversational hearing with a documented word recognition score of 96%. 24 months of calibration records, real ear measurements, speech and noise testing, all signed, all dated, the most recent from 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. In plain English, I said, with her aids in, my grandmother hears and understands better than most 50-year-olds, and I can prove it to a decimal point, going back 2 years. Pierce sat back. He looked at Grandma. He looked at me. Then he said something that told me we'd come to the right ticking radiator. Mrs. Foster. On the night in question. Were you wearing the devices? I was wearing, said my grandmother. The good ears, fitted that morning. My granddaughter can testify to the settings. And they saw you remove. They saw me remove a decoy pair I placed in a candy dish at 8 o'clock that morning, she said. In front of 6 witnesses who have spent 2 years telling each other I'm deaf. Alan Pierce took off his reading glasses, cleaned them slowly with a cloth from his drawer, and put them back on. And then this 60-something probate attorney said with complete professional sincerity, "Ma'am, I have been doing this for 31 years, and I would like to shake your hand." Then the work started. Third question, how do I make what I heard matter? And Pierce's answer took the rest of the morning and became the sealed envelope. Here's what they built, step by step. First, that same day, while it was fresh, Grandma dictated the entire 11 minutes from her spiral notebook. She'd written it down Thanksgiving night in her 40 unbroken minutes at the kitchen table into a formal declaration. Who was present, where each person sat, the time on the kitchen clock when the grinder started. Every sentence, attributed. Dennis's, "She can't even hear us." Paula's appraisal figure, the 3 ways even. Brenda's 1 word. What she was wearing in each ear, make, model, serial numbers. Pierce made her spell them, and I confirmed them against my records by phone from his office, and that cross-reference is in there too. Second, the declaration was signed and notarized that afternoon, dated 4 days after Thanksgiving, by the notary downstairs at the bank. A woman named Diane, who has no idea to this day that the sweet, elderly lady with the nice handwriting was sealing a legal landmine. Third, Pierce sealed the original in an envelope, signed across the flap, logged it into his firm's safe, and gave Grandma a receipt. "This does nothing," he told her, "until the day someone stands up and claims you couldn't hear or understand in the fall of that year. On that day, it does everything. It's dated before any dispute existed. No one can claim you reconstructed it later with help. It sits in my safe and it waits." Like a hearing test, Grandma said, taken before the accident. Exactly like that. And fourth, and this is the part Dennis never saw coming, because Dennis has never once in his life read a document to the end, they redid the estate. Not out of spite. Pierce was very clear, and Grandma was clearer. A revocable living trust. The house on Maple Crest, the accounts, $310,000 across savings and Earl's old brokerage, everything moved into it, with Lorraine as trustee, in full control while living, exactly as before. But with a successor trustee named, in writing, if she were ever incapacitated or gone. She named me. I found out sitting right there when Pierce read the draft aloud. I started to object. I actually said, "Grandma, that's going to look like," and she raised one hand. "The discussion is over hand, the 1999 hand. It will look like what it is," she said. "The one who wrote things down gets to hold the pen." Then she softened, just a little, and added the sentence that I'd put on her headstone if she'd let me be that dramatic. "Nora Jean, they decided I couldn't hear. You spent 2 years making sure I could. A trust is just that, dear. It's the word itself. I'm putting it where it's been earned." We drove home in the early dark. She was quiet most of the way, watching the strip malls go by, and then, turning onto Maple Crest, she said one more thing. "They'll come after Christmas." Dennis said after the holidays, and Dennis has never once been early for anything. She gathered her purse into her lap as we pulled into the driveway. So, we have a month of peace. I intend to enjoy my tree. A pause. And Nora, when it starts, it will start with a doctor. It always starts with a doctor. They'll need paper of their own. She looked at the lit porch, at the house her son had already sold in his head, and her voice went dry as a receipt. Let's see whose paper is older. She was wrong about one thing. It didn't start after the holidays. It started on December 9th at 4:15 on a Tuesday afternoon, when my grandmother called me at the clinic between patients and said 5 words. Dennis just left. Bring cocoa. I closed early. When I got there, she was in her armchair with the crossword. Untouched, I noticed, the pen capped, which for her is the equivalent of pacing a hole in the carpet, and she narrated her son's visit to me the way a bank teller narrates a robbery. Precisely. In order. With timestamps. Dennis had arrived at 2:30, unannounced, with a poinsettia and a manila folder. The poinsettia, she said, was the tell. That man has not brought me a plant since the Reagan administration. He brings a plant. He wants a signature. They'd had coffee. He'd talked about the Pruett house down the street, sold in 9 days, over asking. He'd talked about winter, about the stairs, about how Paula worries. And then he'd opened the folder and slid across her own kitchen table a document with 3 little plastic flags on it, the kind that say SIGN here in cheerful yellow, a durable power of attorney. Financial and medical. Naming Dennis Foster as agent, effective immediately upon signature. He put his hand on mine, Grandma said, and he used the voice. The big print voice. He said, Mom, this is just so I can help with the bills. It's a formality. Everybody our age does it for their parents. She looked at me over her glasses. Everybody our age. He's 58, Nora Jean. He couldn't help a parking meter with its bills. What did you do? I did what I've been doing for 2 years, dear. I was old. She picked up the pen, uncapped it, and finally filled in an answer, and her voice, while she did it, was almost cheerful. I looked at the wrong page. I asked him twice what attorney meant since I already had one. I told him I don't sign anything until my program comes on and my shows were starting. And then I patted his cheek, wrapped up half a coffee cake for Paula, and waved him down the driveway. The pen capped again, click. He left the folder. He'll be back for it. And next time he'll bring reinforcements. Reinforcements arrived the following Monday, and they were exactly what she'd predicted in the car outside Alan Pierce's office. A doctor. Or rather, a doctor's appointment. Yes. Paula called Brenda. Brenda called Grandma. And the message was that the family had scheduled Mom a nice full checkup with Dr. Hammond for January 6th. Everything covered. Memory, hearing, the works. Paula would drive her personally. I want you to sit with the mechanics of this, because this is the part of the story where I stopped being angry the hot way and started being angry the cold way, the way that files things. My family was not scheduling a checkup. They were manufacturing paper. A guardianship petition needs a medical foundation. Pierce had told us so in that first hour, and Dennis's lawyer, we later learned in discovery, had told him the same thing that same week. They needed a physician to write the words cognitive decline and cannot manage her affairs on letterhead. And they had chosen Dr. Hammond because Dr. Hammond was 71 himself, had known the family for decades, was 6 months from retirement, and Paula's actual words from her own text messages, which a subpoena later pulled into the sunlight, Hammond won't make it complicated. He still thinks of her as the little widow from church. The little widow from church called her audiologist granddaughter that night and said, January 6th, clear your morning. I want my own numbers in the room before they take theirs. So on January 4th, 2 days ahead, we ran the full battery at my clinic. Everything by the book, witnessed by my colleague Marisa, who co-signed a second clinician, audiogram, real ear verification, and the crown jewel, speech and noise testing, aided at multi-speaker restaurant-level clatter, the acoustic equivalent of a Foster family Thanksgiving. Word recognition, 96% again. Steady as a metronome for 25 consecutive months. I printed everything in duplicate, sealed one set for Pierce's safe, and handed Grandma her own copy in a green folder because she asked for green. Ledgers are green, she said. This is a ledger. And then January 6th happened, and it did not go the way Paula had formatted it. I drove Grandma myself. That was the first surprise. Paula arrived at 9 to collect her and found the driveway empty and a note taped to the storm door in beautiful Sunday school cursive. Gone to my appointment. See you there, dear. Mom. The second surprise was sitting in Dr. Hammond's waiting room when they walked in. Me, in my white clinic coat, with credentials and the green folder, introduced for the record as both granddaughter and treating audiologist. The third surprise was my grandmother herself, who walked into that exam room wearing her aids, visibly, deliberately, hair tucked back for once in her life, and proceeded to be devastatingly, surgically fine. She knew the date, the season, the president, and the amount of her last property tax bill to the dollar. She counted backward from 100 by sevens like she was strolling downhill. When Hammond gently asked if she ever got confused about her finances, she took out her checkbook register and walked him through October. When he asked about the hearing, the family mentioned some concerns, Lorraine. She folded her hands and said, "I'm glad they're finally concerned, Gerald. 2 years I waited for one of them to be concerned enough to ask me." And she nodded at the green folder, and I took Dr. Hammond through 25 months of clinical data, decibel by decibel, while Paula sat in the corner chair, holding her purse on her knees, like a passenger on a train she just realized was going the wrong direction. Hammond retired in June. But before he did, he put one paragraph in my grandmother's chart, dated January 6th, and Pierce would later read that paragraph aloud in court, with his glasses down on the end of his nose. Patient is alert, fully oriented, cognitively intact, and manages her own affairs with above-average precision. Hearing deficit is fully corrected with professionally maintained devices. Comprehension in conversation is excellent. No clinical basis for concerns regarding capacity. Whose paper is older? And now, whose paper was better? The car ride home from that appointment is the part of this story I've thought about most in the 2 years since. You'd think it would have felt like a victory lap. It didn't. Grandma was silent for the first 10 minutes, watching the salted gray road, and when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the operation in it. It was just her. "You know what the worst part is," she said. "It wasn't a question. It isn't the house. I've made my peace about the house. It's lumber and memories, and I've got the memories in better storage." She turned her wedding ring slowly with her thumb, Earl's ring, 40 years of habit. "The worst part is that being invisible, I could live with. Old women learn invisible. The world teaches you by 50, and you make your accommodations. You become the room." "Fine." Her jaw set. "But being erased, being written out while you're still standing there, holding the coffee pot, in the house where you nurse them, that Nora gene is a different procedure entirely. Invisible is something people fail to see. Erased is something people decide to remove." My son looked at me and performed the arithmetic, and in his arithmetic I had already left. "He's not waiting for my death, sweetheart. As far as Dennis is concerned, it already happened, and the only thing still bothering him," and here she looked out the window at the Pruett house sliding past, "sold sign still in the yard, is that the body keeps making coffee." I had to pull over. "I'm not ashamed to tell you that. I put the car in park on the shoulder of Maple Crest Lane, 4 houses from home, because you cannot see the road properly with your eyes doing what mine were doing." And my 80-year-old grandmother, who had just been dissected and had passed, reached over, patted my hand, and comforted me. Now, she said. "None of that. We're not sad, dear." Argumented. I'm going to pause the story right here for a second. From me to you, honestly. That sentence in the car is why I tell these stories. If you have ever watched a family decide someone was already gone, a grandmother, a father, maybe you, I want to hear about it. Comment deed she was still making the coffee. If this part hit you where it hit me, and tell me who it was for you. I read every single comment, usually at night, usually with tea, the way she'd approve of. And if you're still here, an hour in, you're my kind of listener. Subscribe so you're here for the courtroom. We're getting there. Everything is filed, everything is dated. Because Dennis went back for his folder on January 11th. And this time he didn't bring a poinsettia. He brought Paula. He brought Willow Gardens brochures. He brought a listing agreement with a real estate agent's card clipped to it. And when the big print voice didn't work, and the SIGN here flags didn't work, and his mother looked up at him pleasantly and asked what the rush was, my Uncle Dennis stood in his mother's kitchen, dropped the act for the first time in 2 years, and said the second sentence he would eventually hear read back to him under oath. Mom, you can sign it at the table, or you can sign it after a judge tells you to. Your choice. But this house is getting handled. My grandmother looked at him for a long, unhurried moment. Then she smiled, patted his arm, and said, "What was that, dear? You'll have to speak up." He was in his car 40 seconds later, and through the storm door glass, my grandmother watched her firstborn reverse out of the driveway too fast, clip the trash can, and drive off to file exactly the petition she had been waiting 8 months for him to file. She picked up the phone, dialed Pierce's office from memory. "Alan," she said, "warm up the safe." The petition arrived on the last Thursday of January, hand-delivered by a process server who could not have been more than 25, and who looked genuinely miserable standing on that porch. My grandmother answered the door in her apron, accepted the envelope, thanked him, and, this is true, he testified to it, because Pierce called him as a witness just to establish the timeline, offered him a slice of banana bread for his trouble. He declined. She insisted. He left that porch holding a legal petition he'd just served and a paper plate wrapped in foil, and 14 months later he told a courtroom, under oath, she seemed sharper than my sergeant, ma'am. And I mean, Your Honor, in re, the guardianship and conservatorship of Lorraine Foster, an alleged incapacitated person. I want to read you what the petition actually claimed, because you've been with me this whole story, and you've met this woman. You've watched her run a counterintelligence operation out of a knitting bag. Now read what her son swore to a court under penalty of perjury. That Lorraine Foster, 81, was suffering from progressive cognitive decline. That she was unable to follow or participate in ordinary conversation due to profound hearing loss and confusion. That she had become isolated and suggestible. That she had recently made sudden, uncharacteristic financial arrangements under the undue influence of a family member. That one was aimed at me. Hold on to it, because it comes back around like a boomerang made of paper. And that the appointment of Dennis Foster as guardian and conservator was urgently necessary to protect her person and estate. Her estate. He put the word estate in a filing about a living woman who had beaten him at gin rummy on Christmas Eve. Grandma read the whole thing at her kitchen table, twice, with her aids in and her glasses on, in complete silence. Then she squared the pages, set them down, and delivered her one and only review of the document. He misspelled Callahan. She tapped my name. 2 L's, 1 A between them. It's not difficult. That boy never could proofread. And then she picked up the phone and scheduled with Pierce like she was booking the roofer. But I have to tell you what else that petition did, because this is the part about families that nobody warns you about. Court filing is a stone in a pond. It doesn't just hit the person it's aimed at. The rings go outward, and they reach everyone, and every single member of a family has to decide, publicly, on the record, sometimes literally under oath, where they stand in the water. Brenda called me 4 days after the petition was served, 11 at night, which for Brenda is the middle of the night, and I could hear before she said a word that she'd been crying, and I could hear underneath that, "Forgive me, but I measure sound for a living, the particular wet shame of a person who has been agreeable one step too far. They're saying it's just to help her, Brenda said. Dennis says the trust thing proves someone's been steering her. Paula says you moved yourself into position, Nora. That's the phrase she uses. Moved into position. A shaky breath. And I keep sitting at their table nodding, honey, and then I drive home and I think about Mom asking Tyler twice about the sugar and getting it wrong. And I think she used to get everything wrong like that with us, at every dinner, for 2 years. And Nora. A long silence. Nora, was she pretending? At Thanksgiving. Tell me the truth. Was Mom listening? And I gave my aunt the only answer I was allowed to give, the one Pierce had drilled into me. Because I was a witness now, my records were evidence now, and evidence does not editorialize on the phone at 11 p.m. Brenda, I said, I think you already know what you heard yourself say at that table. And I think the question that's keeping you up isn't whether Mom was listening, it's whether you'd have said anything different if you'd known she was. Silence. 15 seconds of it. I counted, because counting is what I do. That's not fair, Brenda whispered. No, I agreed. It's accurate. Those are different instruments, Aunt Brenda. Get some sleep. She hung up, and I sat there with the phone in my hand, feeling the specific loneliness of holding a boundary with someone you love. And if you've held one, you know it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like standing very still in cold water. But here's what I knew, and Brenda didn't, yet. Mercy was still on the table. It never left the table. My grandmother had a rule about that, and you'll hear it from her own mouth before this story ends. The door stays open. What changes is what's behind it. Tyler was next, and Tyler surprised everyone. My cousin showed up at my clinic on a Saturday in February. No call, no text, just Tyler at 27 in his work jacket, standing in my waiting room among the hearing aid brochures, looking the way he'd looked at Thanksgiving by the bookshelves. Like a visitor in his own family. I'm not here to spy, he said, first thing. Hands up. Dad doesn't know I came. I need to ask you something, and I need you not to lie to me, because everybody in this family lies to me in a nice voice, and He ran out of sentence and started another one. The petition says Grandma can't follow a conversation, but I taught her to text last spring, Nora. She uses punctuation. She corrected my spelling. On Tuesday, she sent me a paragraph about the bird feeder with a semicolon in it. He looked at me, and he was pale. People who can't follow a conversation don't use semicolons. So either something's very wrong with Grandma really, suddenly, or something's very wrong with my dad. And I'm asking the only person in this family who writes things down, which is it? I looked at my cousin, Dennis's own son, raised at Paula's table, 27 years old and holding, without knowing it, the exact question a judge was going to hold, and I made a decision I do not regret. Tyler, I said, I can't discuss Grandma's records, or the case, but you just told me she texts you paragraphs, with semicolons. I let that sit. You don't need my testimony. You have your own. Save those texts. And maybe ask yourself why, in a family this loud, you're the only one she writes to. He stood there a second. Then he nodded, once, like something had finished loading, and left. He didn't slam the door. Tyler never slams doors. But I watched him sit in his truck in my parking lot for 11 minutes before he drove off, and he wasn't on his phone. He was just sitting, deciding. Hold on to Tyler. He matters in the ledger. Meanwhile, and I say this with a certain professional appreciation, the way you'd admire a virus under a microscope, Paula went to work on the narrative. Because Paula understood something Dennis didn't. Guardianship cases are won on story, and her story needed a villain who wasn't her, so she built one out of me. February and March, the calls went out. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years suddenly checking in. We heard Lorraine put everything in a trust, with Nora in charge. Isn't that fast? Grandma's neighbor cornered me at the pharmacy, apologetic. Paula had been by worried sick, asking whether I was over at the house a lot, whether Lorraine seemed dependent on me. Even at church, my grandmother's church, where Paula had appeared maybe 6 Easters in 30 years, she materialized in a navy coat, sat beside Grandma, held her hand during the hymns, and afterward told 2 ladies of the altar guild, in a carrying whisper, that the family was praying they could protect Mom from being taken advantage of, but the poor thing can't even hear the warnings. They told Grandma, of course. The altar guild is faster than a subpoena, and my grandmother listened, nodded, thanked them, and went home and added it to the notebook. Date, location, witnesses. Because by then she wasn't keeping a diary anymore. She was keeping what Pierce, reviewing it in March with his glasses on the end of his nose, described in 3 words, "I will treasure until I die. Ma'am, this is discovery." The hearing was set for the 3rd week of April, and in the last week of March, Dennis's attorney, a downtown litigator named Kessler with a firm handshake and, we would all eventually learn, a client who had not told him everything, sent Pierce the standard demand. Any and all documents concerning Lorraine Foster's medical condition, mental capacity, and estate planning. Pierce called Grandma to walk her through it. I was there for lunch. She put him on speaker between us, next to the soup. "They're entitled to the trust documents," Pierce said. "They're entitled to Dr. Hammond's records, which, as we know, help them the way an anvil helps a swimmer. They're entitled to Nora's clinical files, all 25 months. A pause, and I could hear him smiling in that dry way of his through the phone. "And Lorraine, they ask for everything, which means I'm ethically obligated to disclose the existence of one sealed, notarized declaration dated November 28th, currently in my safe. I won't have to reveal the contents yet, only that it exists and its date." My grandmother stirred her soup once, slowly. "Only that it exists," she repeated, "and its date." She looked up at me, and 81 years looked like a lit fuse. Good. Let Dennis's lawyer ask him what his mother wrote down 4 days after Thanksgiving. She picked up her spoon. Let's see whose hands forget first. Kessler's office received Pierce's disclosure letter on a Friday. By the following Wednesday, we knew exactly how it had landed, because that Wednesday evening, for the first time in 4 months, Dennis Foster called his mother. Grandma let it ring 3 times. Then she answered, put it on speaker, and set the phone on the kitchen table between herself and the notebook, uncapping her pen with her thumb like a woman clocking in. I wasn't there for that call. I want to be precise about that, because precision is the whole spine of this story. What I'm about to give you comes from her notes, taken in real time, later attached as an exhibit, and from the fact that Dennis, under oath in April, confirmed the substance of it word by miserable word, because by then denying things his mother had written down had stopped working as a legal strategy. He opened warm. That's the part that broke my heart a little, reading it afterward. He opened warm, the boy she'd nursed through scarlet fever, asking how her hip was, whether the furnace was behaving, whether she'd watched the parade. 4 minutes of weather. And my grandmother, who counts silences, sat there and let him spend his 4 minutes, writing in the margin. And this is verbatim. It's in the exhibit. He's circling. Hands are talking. And then, Mom, listen. This lawyer stuff, it's gotten away from everybody, hasn't it? Kessler's telling me about some sealed thing your guys got in a safe, some declaration, from November. A laugh with nothing in it. Then what is that? What's in it? My grandmother wrote one word in the notebook, there, and said aloud, It's dated November 28th, dear. You were at the house on the 27th. What do you suppose I might have wanted written down the very next morning? 11 seconds of silence. She counted. It's in the notes. 11. Mom. Different voice now. The big print voice was gone. What came through the little speaker, she wrote, was the voice of the boy caught behind the garage with Earl's cigarettes, 50 years on. Mom, whatever you think you heard at Thanksgiving. Think I heard, she repeated, pleasantly, the way she does. You didn't have your... Mom, You don't wear them at dinner. Everybody knows you don't wear them at dinner. That's not. And then my Uncle Dennis stopped talking, because somewhere in the middle of that sentence, he heard it himself. Everybody knows you don't wear them at dinner. 11 months before a judge would say it back to him, Dennis had just discovered, live, the load-bearing flaw in his entire case. It required him to explain, in detail, exactly what he'd been comfortable saying in front of his mother, and why he'd been comfortable. You cannot argue she couldn't hear us without also answering. And what was it you needed her not to hear? My grandmother let the silence sit until it was fully cured. Then she said, and I've read this line so many times the page is soft, Dennis, you have a choice, and I'm going to lay it out the way I laid out your school clothes. Withdraw the petition. Come to Sunday dinner. We will eat pot roast and never speak of this winter again. That door stays open until I die, because I'm your mother. And unlike some parties to this conversation, I know what that word means. Or, keep going. Walk us all into that courtroom in April. But understand, dear, in that room, someone is going to open my mail. A pause, and the pen, per the margin note, was capped. You've already heard everything in that envelope once, sweetheart. You were there. The only question is whether you'd like to hear it again, in front of a judge, at your own request. Mom, Sunday, pot roast, 2 o'clock, said my grandmother, and hung up on him, and, per the final margin note, finished 17 across. He didn't come to Sunday dinner. Paula made sure of it. We know that from the text messages, and I'll spare you all of them except the one that Kessler himself, in April, visibly wished did not exist, the one Paula sent Dennis that Saturday night. If you fold now, the trust stands, and that girl gets everything. The envelope is a bluff. Deaf is deaf. Hold the line. Deaf is deaf. 4 words. My profession reduced to a coin flip, my grandmother reduced to a diagnosis she didn't have, by a woman whose entire case now rested on a bet about decibels, placed against the only licensed audiologist in the family. Paula, I have thought 100 times since, you really should have asked me. I'd have quoted you my rates. Consultations are cheaper than verdicts, so they held the line. The petition stayed. April came on, the way April does, Grandma's tulips first, then the court date, in that order, because she planted the tulips herself in October. And if you don't understand why an 81-year-old woman facing a competency hearing spent an afternoon on her knees planting bulbs she was accused of being too far gone to remember, then you haven't been listening the way she taught me to. She was filing a motion with the dirt. Tulips are dated evidence. They come up in spring and testify. Quick pause here. From me to you, third and last one before the courtroom, I promise. I want to ask you the question this whole part turns on, because I genuinely want to read your answers tonight. Dennis got the offer every villain in these stories secretly prays for. Withdraw. Come to dinner. All is forgiven. Pot roast at 2. A full pardon, no conditions, from the woman he'd tried to erase. And he let a text message talk him out of it. So tell me in the comments, *pot roast, if you think that offer should ever have been on the table, or let them walk into court if you think mercy like that is wasted on people still holding the knife. I read every one, and this one splits my viewers right down the middle every time. And if you're this deep with me, 90 minutes in, you already know you're staying for the verdict. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes out of that envelope. It's 4 pages. It takes 9 minutes to read aloud. I know, because I was in the second row when Alan Pierce read it. The hearing was set for April 17th, 9 a.m. Probate Division, the Honorable Marianne Voss presiding, a detail that mattered more than we knew, because Judge Voss, Pierce told us in the hallway with the flat non-smile of a man counting cards, had spent 11 years in elder law before the bench. She's seen this exact movie, he said quietly, from every seat in the theater. Do not perform for her, Lorraine. Just be exactly what you are. Alan, said my grandmother, smoothing her coat, the good navy one, with Earl's small gold pin on the lapel. I have been exactly what I am for 81 years. It's the rest of them who brought costumes. The courtroom was smaller than television promises you. On wood, gray carpet, a clock with a hum I could hear from the second row. 60 hertz if you're curious. I can't turn it off. The hearing things, it's how I'm built. Dennis and Paula sat with Kessler at the petitioner's table. Dennis, in a suit I'd last seen at a funeral, which I choose to believe was not symbolism. Brenda sat behind them. But on the aisle, I noticed, half-turned, a woman keeping one foot in the exit of her own allegiance. Tyler came in 4 minutes late in his work jacket and did something that made Paula's head turn like a hinge snapping. He walked past the petitioner's side entirely and sat down next to me. Semicolons, he said quietly, by way of explanation, eyes forward. And then the bailiff said the words, and everyone stood, and Judge Marianne Voss took the bench, put on her glasses, opened the file, and read silently for what the wall clock told me was 90 full seconds while the room held its breath. She looked up, found the petitioner's table. "Mr. Kessler," she said, "before we begin, I've reviewed the file, including respondent's exhibit list. I see a treating physician's capacity note, 25 months of audiological records, and one sealed declaration dated November 28th, notarized held by respondent's counsel since 4 days after the events your petition describes." She took the glasses off and folded them, and the hum of that clock was suddenly the loudest thing in the county. "So my first question, counsel, is for your client." Judge Voss looked directly at my Uncle Dennis and asked the question his entire life had been driving toward like a nail toward a magnet. "Mr. Foster, before I unseal a document your own mother wrote about you, would you like to tell me, in your own words, what you believe is in it?" Silence has a texture. I've built a career on the edges of it, and I'm telling you that the silence after Judge Voss's question was the densest I have ever stood inside. 11 seconds. I counted, the way she taught me. The same 11 seconds Dennis had gone quiet on the phone in March, his personal unit of drowning. Kessler rose halfway. "Your Honor, my client can't be expected to speculate about." "He's not speculating, counsel." Voss didn't raise her voice. "Judges like her never need to. The room adjusts its gain automatically. Your petition states, I'm reading it, that the respondent cannot follow or participate in ordinary conversation." The declaration in question was written about a conversation, held at a dinner table, at which your client was present, and by all accounts, speaking freely. She set the page down. "So Mr. Foster either knows precisely what's in that envelope, because he said it, or his petition is correct. His mother couldn't hear a thing, and the envelope holds 4 pages of an old woman's imagination. It is genuinely one or the other, counsel. Both doors are right there. He may pick whichever he likes." I watched my uncle look at those 2 doors. I watched him understand, in real time on the record, that they were the same door. We spoke about her future," Dennis said finally, "as a family. Her care. Maybe things came out wrong, taken out of context?" "Context," said Judge Voss, making a small note, "is exactly what I intend to get." "Proceed, Mr. Kessler. Call your evidence." And Kessler tried. "I want to be fair to the man. Pierce told us later that Kessler was competent, even good, and that watching him that morning was like watching a skilled carpenter discover, nail by nail, that his client had sold him a house made of fog. He called the neighbor, Mrs. Aldrich, who testified that Lorraine did seem quieter these last couple of years at gatherings, and then, on cross, cheerfully told Pierce that Lorraine had also caught a billing error on their shared fence repair, to the penny, in about a minute in her head. He offered the family's observations of confusion, the sugar incident, the mixed-up names, the "what was that, dear?" Pierce didn't even challenge them. He simply asked each witness the same quiet question. "And on those occasions, do you know whether Mrs. Foster was wearing her hearing devices?" And assumed she wasn't, and she never wore them around us, and from Paula, a tight, "How would I possibly know that?" pile up in the transcript, like cordwood. He was building something, and I could see Judge Voss watching him build it. 2 years of moments where the family had diagnosed comprehension failure without once checking for a signal. That's not dementia, ladies and gentlemen. That's attenuation. It has a fix, and the fix has a paper trail, and the paper trail had a licensed custodian, and at 10:40 a.m. the custodian was sworn in. Me. I'd testified before workers' comp cases, a disability appeal, but never with my grandmother's eyes on my back and my uncle's on my face. Pierce kept it surgical, exactly as we'd rehearsed, because my job up there was narrow, and I want you to hear how narrow, since half the comments on stories like this ask, how did you not get accused of orchestrating everything? Here's how. I never once characterized my family. I never used the words lie, greedy, or plot. I answered questions about physics and paperwork, because physics and paperwork were the only things I'd ever contributed. I did not testify against my uncle. I testified about decibels. 25 months of records went up on the little courtroom screen, one exhibit at a time. The audiogram, volume problem, not comprehension problem. Real ear measurements. The speech and noise scores in restaurant-level clatter, month after month after month, 95, 96, 96. And then Pierce asked the question the entire case funneled through. Callahan, in plain terms, on the evening of the dinner in question, if Mrs. Foster was wearing devices you had fitted that morning, programmed as you've described, could she hear and understand normal conversation at that table? Yes. How confident are you? It's not confidence, Mr. Pierce. It's measurement. Word recognition of 96%, aided in noise louder than that dining room. She would have understood conversational speech at that table better than most people in this courtroom would. Kessler on cross went where he had to go. Wasn't I the successor trustee? Didn't I stand to control everything? Hadn't I fitted the devices, kept the records, driven her to the lawyer? Wasn't this whole architecture mine? And I looked at him and gave him the answer Pierce had never coached, because it didn't need coaching. Mr. Kessler, my records begin 25 months ago, a year before anyone touched a trust or a lawyer. I documented my grandmother's hearing the same way I document every one of my 400 patients, because it's the standard of care. If keeping accurate records for 2 years makes a person suspicious, sir, then the problem isn't my filing cabinet. I paused, and I said the sentence that ended up in the local paper's write-up. I didn't build this evidence. A client spoke it. I just made sure the room could hear. Kessler sat down. It was 11:15. Then came the part Dennis's side had demanded themselves, months earlier, in the petition, the independent evaluation. Because when you allege incapacity, the court doesn't take anyone's family word for it. It appoints its own expert, and in February, Dr. Fia Simone Aranda, geriatric neuropsychologist, court's own pick, had spent 4.5 hours with Lorraine Foster across 2 sessions. Her report was already in the file. Voss had Kessler read the summary paragraph aloud himself. A small judicial cruelty I have replayed, I admit, more than once. Cognition, intact across every domain. Memory, above age norms. Executive function, the managing your own affairs muscle. Superior, the examinee balanced a complex hypothetical household budget faster than the examiner. Susceptibility to undue influence, notably low. Examinee demonstrates firm, internally consistent decision-making, and in this examiner's professional opinion would be exceptionally difficult to steer against her own judgment. And then the final line, which Dr. Elaine Aranda later confirmed from the stand with a completely straight face. The examinee concluded the second session by identifying a scoring error in the examiner's materials. She was correct. That was the case, really. It was over by lunch, and everyone in that blonde wood room knew it, except somehow Paula, who sat through all of it with her chin at the angle of a woman being wronged by mathematics. The petition was dead. Voss could have ruled from the bench before noon, but there was one exhibit left, and here is the thing I didn't understand until it happened. The envelope no longer needed to be opened. The case was already won without it. Pierce leaned over to Grandma at the respondent's table. I was close enough to hear, and whispered, "Lorraine, we don't need it. I can rest here. It stays sealed if you want. Your call." And my grandmother, 81 years old, 4 feet from the son who had sworn to a court that her mind was gone, looked at the little gray-green envelope on Pierce's table. 8 months in a safe. 4 days younger than the sentence, "She can't even hear us." And she said, in a voice that did not perform and did not tremble and carried to every corner of that quiet room, "Open my mail, Alan." My family went to a great deal of trouble to say all of that in front of me. She folded her hands. The least this family can do is hear it back, all of it, out loud, while I watch. Judge Voss looked at Kessler. Kessler, who by now understood everything, looked at his shoes. "No objection," he said, in the voice of a man requesting a blindfold. The bailiff carried the envelope to the bench. Judge Voss verified the notary seal, the date, the unbroken flap, read the label into the record. Declaration of Lorraine Foster, executed November 28th, sealed and held by counsel, and handed it back to Pierce. Alan Pierce put on his reading glasses. He slit the flap with a pocket knife older than me. He drew out 4 handwritten pages in beautiful Sunday school cursive, cleared his throat, and read the first line into the record. "My name is Lorraine Foster. I am 80 years old. My hearing is corrected, my mind is my own, and 4 days ago, at my own table, I listened to my children plan the rest of my life. I wrote it all down while the coffee was still warm. It begins like this: 9 minutes. That's how long it takes to read 4 handwritten pages aloud at courtroom pace, and I want you to understand what those 9 minutes were like in that room, because I've never experienced anything like them, and I measure rooms for a living." Nobody moved. The 60 hertz hum of the clock disappeared under Pierce's voice the way a pure tone disappears under speech, masked, my field calls it. Judge Voss followed along on the certified copy, and my grandmother sat with her hands folded on the respondent's table, chin level, watching her own words cross the room and land on the people who'd said them. Because that's what the declaration was. It was them. Pierce read, and one by one, the Thanksgiving table reassembled itself in that courtroom, seat by seat, sentence by sentence, in Sunday school cursive. At approximately 7:40 p.m., after I started the coffee grinder, my son Dennis said to the table, "Okay, while she's in there, we need to talk about Mom." Dennis's shoulders dropped a centimeter. I watched it happen. 1 centimeter, like a man settling into a chair he'd been dreading. My daughter-in-law Paula produced a folder. She stated that Willow Gardens had an opening after the first of the year at $2,900 monthly, and that my house had appraised in October at $740,000. Conservatively, she said, Paula did not drop a centimeter. Paula sat perfectly still, staring at a point on the wall above the judge's head, in the posture of a woman who has decided that if she does not move, time cannot proceed. Time proceeded. My son said the market would only hold through spring. My daughter Brenda asked whether anyone had asked me. My son told her that asking me was a formality. And then my son said the following, which I am recording word for word because I intend never to forget it and never to have to trust my memory about it. "Relax. She can't even hear us. She won't remember any of this. We settle it now, between us, and after the holidays we present it to her nice and simple. 1 page. Big print." Pierce paused there. He's a professional. It wasn't theater. He paused because the next line in the declaration required a page turn. But in the gap, the room did something I will remember on my deathbed. Every head in that courtroom, the judge, the clerk, the bailiff, Kessler, Mrs. Aldrich in the gallery, Every head turned at once, quietly, toward Dennis Foster. Physics again. Sound had gone out into the room 2 Novembers ago, and the echo had finally come back, and everyone instinctively looked at the source. Someone laughed, Pierce read. It was Paula. Brenda made a sound then. Small, involuntary, the sound of a person locating themselves on a map they'd hoped they weren't on. Because the next paragraph was hers, and she knew it. Everyone who'd been at that table knew it, and my grandmother, I told you she counts silences, had written it down with the same care she gave everything else. The proceeds were to be divided 3 ways after my care costs. My son said, even, fair's fair. My daughter Brenda said one word. She said even. She did not say anything else. I am writing down what my daughter did not say, because I heard that too. I am writing down what my daughter did not say, because I heard that too. In the second row, Tyler exhaled through his teeth. On the aisle behind the petitioner's table, Brenda bent forward, very slowly, until her forehead nearly touched the pew in front of her and stayed there. And still Pierce read. The last page now. Grandma's inventory of the aftermath. The decoy aids in the candy dish, placed at 8 that morning. The serial numbers of the pair in her ears, cross-checked that same night against my clinic records. The settings. The distance from her chair to Dennis's, which she had measured the next day with Earl's tape measure, 9 feet 4 inches, because my grandmother does not submit approximations to posterity. And then the final paragraph, and Pierce slowed down for it, because some sentences deserve their full duration. I am not writing this in anger. I checked before I began. I sat with it for 2 days, the way you check a pot roast, and it is not anger. I'm writing this because I have been the record keeper of this family since 1962, and no one else was going to write it down. If you are hearing this read aloud, then my children chose a courtroom over a kitchen. And that was the one decision I left entirely to them. Signed, Lorraine Foster. Witnessed and notarized, November 28th. Pierce set the pages down. He took off his reading glasses. Nothing further, Your Honor. And Judge Voss looked at the petitioner's table for a long moment and said, Mr. Kessler, does your client wish to respond? And Dennis Foster, and honestly, I've turned this over 100 times, whether it was strategy or shock or just the last reflex of a man whose every plan had been read back to him in his mother's handwriting, Dennis stood up. Kessler's hand came up to stop him, and missed. My uncle stood in that courtroom, pointed across the aisle at the respondent's table, and played the only card he had ever had, one final time at full volume. She's, Your Honor, this is exactly what I've been saying. Look at this. It's a performance. She sat there that whole night letting us talk, baiting us. A confused old woman doesn't do that. And now everyone's acting like she heard every word. He stopped. The room had gone very still, and my uncle heard his own sentence 1/2 second after the rest of us did. The way you always hear yourself in a quiet room, too late. My grandmother rose. Nobody told her to. Later, the clerk told Pierce that in 19 years she'd never seen Judge Voss let someone stand unbidden without a word. But Voss just watched, one hand loosely over her gavel, the way you'd shield a candle that didn't need it. Lorraine Foster, 5'2" in her good navy coat with Earl's pin on the lapel, faced her firstborn son across 9 feet. I'd estimate 9 feet 4 inches of gray courtroom carpet. And when she spoke, her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Best calibrated ears in the county, and I promise you, that room needed no assistance at all. Acting like she heard every word, she repeated, giving each syllable back to him gently, like returning a borrowed dish. No, Dennis, I heard every word. She let it stand for 1 beat. There's no acting anywhere in that envelope, sweetheart. There's only minutes. I kept the minutes of the meeting you held about me, at my table, over my pie. The way I've kept this family's minutes for 60 years. You mistook the secretary for the furniture. She gathered her coat closed at the collar, one small movement, closing the ledger. You may sit down now, dear. This part you'll want to hear. He sat. God help me, he sat like the boy who'd been called on in church. Judge Voss waited until the room settled, put her glasses back on, and ruled from the bench. I could summarize it, but Grandma keeps the certified transcript in the knitting bag now, where the notebook used to live, and some sentences deserve to be quoted. So here is Judge Marianne Voss, verbatim. For the record, the petition is denied in its entirety. This court finds the respondent not merely competent, but, and I do not say this often, among the most competent individuals to appear before this bench in any capacity. The evidence establishes no cognitive impairment whatsoever. What it establishes is a hearing loss, professionally corrected and meticulously documented, which members of this family found more convenient to treat as an absence. She looked up over the glasses directly at Dennis and Paula. Mr. Foster, you petitioned this court on the theory that your mother could not hear or understand you. The record before me shows she is, quite possibly, the only member of this family who was listening. Petition denied. Petitioners bear respondents' costs and fees. We're adjourned. The gavel came down once, softly, almost politely, the way Grandma closes a door. And here's the moment I choose to end this part on. Not the gavel, after it. The room stood, the clerk called all rise, and in the shuffle my grandmother turned around, found me and Tyler in the second row, and did something she has done at the end of every hymn, every graduation, every funeral, and every fight of my entire life. She checked her hair with one hand, picked up her purse, and mouthed clear as a bell across the emptying courtroom. Pot roast. Jay, 2:00. Because the door, and you need to understand this about her, it's the whole spine of the woman. The door was still open. Even then, even for Dennis. What was behind it, though, had changed completely. And on Sunday, at 2:00 over pot roast, my grandmother laid the new arrangement on the table. 1 page, as promised. Big print, as promised. She has a long memory for phrasing. That page is the last document in this story, and what it did to each member of this family over the next 6 months, one by one. That's the part you stayed for. Sunday, 2:00, pot roast. I need to tell you who actually came, because the guest list itself was the first entry in the new ledger. Me. Tyler, who arrived 20 minutes early and carried chairs like a man applying for citizenship in a country he'd just discovered. Brenda, who stood on the porch for a full 90 seconds before ringing the bell of the house she grew up in. I watched her through the window, and I let her have the 90 seconds, because some doors you have to walk through at your own speed. And a 2-4, a car in the driveway. Dennis's sedan. It sat there, engine off for 3 minutes. Grandma carved the roast and didn't look up. At 2:07, the driver's door opened, and my uncle got out, alone. Paula was in the passenger seat and stayed in it, facing forward for the entire hour and 40 minutes that followed, a navy-coated statue of a woman who would rather sit in a cooling car than eat one bite of accountability. Grandma glanced out once, registered the arrangement, and said mildly to the gravy, "Well, half of him showed up. That's the half I fed." Dinner was, and this is the thing nobody warns you about these stories, dinner was quiet. Not cold, quiet. Past dishes, small requests, Tyler talking about a job site, Brenda's hands shaking slightly every time she lifted her water glass. Dennis ate like a man at a parole hearing, which, in every way that mattered, he was. And my grandmother presided over all of it exactly as she had for 60 years, because the point, she told me later, drying dishes, the point was never to banish him from the table. Anyone can throw a person out, Nora Jean. That's just noise. The trick is to let them keep their chair and change what the chair is worth. With the pie, she brought out the page. 1 page. Big print, 18-point, I'd guess. She'd had Pierce's office print it, and I am certain to my bones she specified the font size out loud, with relish. She set it in the middle of the table, next to the pie, precisely where Paula's folder had sat 2 Novembers before. Geometry as testimony. and she let everyone read it where it lay, because she was done reading things to people who had decided she couldn't. Engelskines, A1, I'll give it to you the way it sat on that table. The arrangement, L. Foster, Trustee 1. The house, the accounts, and everything else now live in a trust. I control it while I breathe. When I stop, Nora administers it. This is not a secret. This is a fact, and facts don't require anyone's approval, only their attention. 2. The trust will pay, in full, for education, any grandchild, any great-grandchild, trade school or college, forever. It will pay for medical emergencies, for anyone in this family, no questions asked. It will never pay a debt, fund a venture, cover a mortgage shortfall, or float anyone until spring. It is a ladder, not a couch. 3. Dennis remains my son. His portion of the inheritance now sits in a sub-trust that releases on a schedule, beginning 10 years from today, reduced by every dollar of my legal costs he was ordered to pay and hasn't. His children's education, see item 2, is untouched. What a man's choices cost him should never be billed to his children. I learned that watching this family. 4. Sunday dinner is at 2. The door is open. The checkbook is closed. Anyone confused about the difference may reread item 1, 5. I have recorded who came today. I record everything. You all know that now. Dennis read it twice. I watched his eyes make the second pass. Slower, the way you reread a diagnosis. And then my uncle did the only genuinely surprising thing he did in this entire 2-year story. He didn't argue. He looked up at his mother, opened his mouth, and she raised one finger. Not the discussion is overhand, one finger. Wait. Before you say anything, Grandma said, I want you to understand what that page is, Dennis, because I wrote it in your language. It's the deal you offered me in January. Nice and simple. 1 page, big print. She cut a slice of pie and set it in front of him, and her voice, I swear to you, was gentle. Gentler than I'd heard it since the diagnosis days, since my mother. You wanted my life settled on 1 page, sweetheart. There it is. The only difference between your page and mine, she handed him a fork, is that mine got read aloud to the person it was about, while she was in the room. That difference has a name, dear. It's called respect, and as you can see, it fits on paper just fine. My Uncle Dennis looked at the page, and at the pie, and at his mother, and he said, quietly into his plate, but I heard it, and her ears are better than mine. The gutters. I noticed pulling in, the back corners coming loose again, a pause. I could come by Tuesday. If that's... He didn't finish the sentence. My grandmother looked at her firstborn son for a long moment, and something in her face moved the way frequencies move below where most people can perceive it. Tuesday, she said. There's coffee at 10, there always was. Paula honked the horn. I want to hold this moment one more second before we get to the 6 months later of it all, because I know some of you are in the comments right now typing, he got off too easy, and I'm going to push back gently the way she would. Dennis lost the case, lost the costs, lost control of the money for a decade, and lost something bigger. He now lives in a family where everyone knows exactly what he said when he thought the room was empty. That's not getting off. That's a life sentence with visitation. What Grandma kept was the only thing she'd ever wanted kept, a chair at her table with his name on it and the terms in writing. So here's my last question of the night, and it's the one this whole channel runs on, asterisk, the door open, and the checkbook closed. Is that mercy? Or is that the coldest revenge of all? Tell me which one in the comments, mercy or revenge, and tell me why. I read every answer, and I still haven't fully decided myself. And if this story got to you the way it gets to me every time I tell it, subscribe. The next one starts where this one ends. With what 6 months can do to a family that finally knows exactly who heard what. Because here's where they all landed. The ledger. Every name. One by one, and I'll start with the one you're angriest at, because that's how she'd have organized it too. Asterisk Paula? Paula never came back inside the house on Maple Crest. Not once. And the strange justice of it, the kind you couldn't write if it hadn't happened, is what that turned into. She stopped coming, and then she discovered that the family simply continued. Dinners happened. Birthdays happened. Photos got taken and she wasn't in them, and nobody rescheduled, and nobody called to smooth it over, because the one thing Paula had always counted on, being the engine, being the room's necessary appliance, turned out to be a role the room had quietly recast. At Tyler's engagement dinner in September, she sat at the far end, present but unconsulted, and I watched her watch the table talk across her, around her, past her, a normal voice at close range, as if her chair were empty. She looked up once, halfway through, and caught my grandmother's eye down the length of that table. And Grandma, who counts silences, who taught me that the room is never empty. Grandma smiled at her pleasantly, lifted the coffee pot and said, "What was that, dear? You'll have to speak up. Dennis. He came that Tuesday, fixed the gutter, and come the Tuesday after that, for no stated reason, and the one after that, and somewhere around the fourth Tuesday it stopped needing a reason and became what it now is, coffee at 10. Her list of small repairs on the counter in Sunday school cursive, him working through it in silence while she does the crossword within eyeshot. They don't discuss the case. They discussed it once, in October, when Dennis set down his coffee and got as far as, "Mom, that night, at Thanksgiving, I want you to know I never." And my grandmother put down her pen and said, "Dennis, I have it in writing, you have it in memory. Between the two of us, the record is complete. Hand me that screwdriver." That's her version of absolution. She doesn't erase the entry. She just keeps writing new ones on the next line. He sold the sedan in the fall. The payments, we learned, had been eating him alive for a year, and started driving a 15-year-old pickup he owns outright. And I noticed my grandmother noticed, because the day he first parked it in her driveway, she made his coffee without being asked. In her ledger, a paid-for truck is a moral document. The 10-year sub-trust stands. He has never once asked about it. I administer the paperwork now, and I can tell you the balance to the penny, and I can tell you he could have contested it and didn't. Make of that what you will. I've made something of it, Brenda. Brenda did the hardest thing anyone in this story did, and I include the envelope. 4 days after the pot roast, she showed up at Grandma's door with nothing in her hands. No casserole, no card, no delivery mechanism smile. And said, standing on the mat, "Mom." I said, "Even. I want to talk about the fact that I said even." And they talked. 2 hours, kitchen table, door closed, and neither of them has ever told me what was said, and I have never asked, because some records are sealed for good reason. What I can report is the observable data. On the first Saturday of the following month, when I unlocked the clinic at 9 a.m., there were 2 women standing there with 3 coffees. Brenda comes to every calibration now. She sits in the booth. She's learned what the graphs mean. Last month she asked me, quietly, to test her own hearing. Because I want to know what I can hear, Nora. It turns out that was never the same question as what I was willing to. Her word recognition is fine. Her listening, these days, is better than fine. Those are different instruments. She knows that now. Tyler got engaged in September to a woman named Dana, who fixes transmissions and calls my grandmother boss, which delights her without limit. He visits Maple Crest most weekends, not Tuesdays. Tuesdays are his father's, and Tyler understands scheduling as a form of respect. At the engagement dinner, he stood up, tapped his glass, and gave a toast nobody expected. To my grandmother, who taught me that in this family, you'd better say what you mean because somebody is definitely getting it in writing. Longest laugh of the night. Grandma laughed hardest. Then she took out the little notebook and pretended to write it down, and the room lost its mind, and Paula, at the far end, looked at her plate. Tyler and Dana's future kids' education, item 2, fully funded, untouched. What a man's choices cost him should never be billed to his children. She built that sentence for Tyler before Tyler ever chose a seat in a courtroom. That's the thing about her. She funds the mercy in advance. The rest of the file. Dr. Hammond retired in June. Grandma sent a card. Kessler sent Pierce a one-line note after the ruling. Next time, warn a man, which Pierce has framed in his office above the safe. Judge Voss's ruling got written up in the County Bar newsletter under a headline Grandma clipped and magnetized to the refrigerator, where it lives between Tyler's engagement photo and a coupon for pot roast, listening as evidence. And Lorraine Foster turned 82 in March. The whole family came, every chair full but one, and that one by its owner's choice, and the pot roast was 6 pounds. Here is what I want you to know about that birthday, the detail I've been saving. Nobody talked over her, not once, all afternoon. Every person at that table looked at her when they spoke, faced her, finished their sentences, and waited for hers. It took a courtroom to teach them what a hearing aid can't fix. The devices give you back the sound, but I can't calibrate people. A judge, it turns out, can. She used part of the trust income to start something. The Earl and Lorraine Foster Hearing Fund, administered through my clinic, paying for hearing aids for elderly patients whose insurance won't and whose families haven't noticed. Her one rule for eligibility, dictated to me across the booth, is now printed on the intake form, and I quote, "Priority to any applicant whose family has stopped talking to them on the assumption they can't hear it. We know what that costs. We pay for it here." Last Thursday, the fund fitted its 19th patient, a retired schoolteacher, 84, whose daughter had done all the talking at the intake. She's confused, she doesn't follow, you'll see, while the woman sat there, nodding, smiling in the right places, bluffing. You know the pattern now. You've spent 2 hours inside it. I fitted her, programmed her, ran the final check, and turned her chair toward the window, away from her daughter, and asked her, at normal volume, in normal speech, what she'd like to hear first. And this 84-year-old stranger looked at me with my grandmother's exact expression, the porch swing look, the watch their hands look, and said, "Honey, I've been hearing everything for years. What I'd like," and she tilted her head toward her daughter, "is for it to be my turn." I laughed. And then I did what I always do now, what I will do for the rest of my career, first Saturday of every month and every day in between. I wrote it down. Because here's the lesson, and it's the only one this story has. The quietest person in your family is not the emptiest chair at your table. They are, almost always, the fullest ledger in the room. Assume everyone can hear you. Better yet, say only things that survive being heard. So now I have to know, and this comment section decides it. My grandmother left the door open and closed the checkbook, forever. Asterisk if it were you. Do you keep that door open for the son who priced your coffin while you poured his coffee? Or do you lock it and never look back? Door open or door locked? Pick one. Defend it, Liner said. The answers to this one keep me up at night, in the best way. If you made it here, 2 hours, all 12 courses, you're family now, and family subscribes. Next week's story. A family that put their grandmother's worthless dog on the curb along with the granddaughter who loved it, not knowing the will had one condition, 36 vet receipts, and a signed surrender form with their own names on it. It's called Take the Stupid Dog. You'll want to be early. Okay, real talk for a second. Just me and you, story's over. I tell a lot of these. This one's different for me, and I'll tell you why. Everybody asks about the envelope, the courtroom, the judge. Nobody asks about the 2 years before it, the 2 years a sharp, funny, entirely present woman sat at a full table and was treated like weather. The revenge isn't the part that matters. The part that matters is Tuesday. So coffee at 10, a gutter that gets fixed. Call somebody's grandmother today. Talk to her. She hears more than you think, and somewhere, trust me, she's keeping minutes. Good night.